Senator, you saw the indictments on Friday. I guess that only makes your legislation with Marco Rubio all the more important, doesn't it?
I think it does. We now know that, well, we knew all along, obviously, that the Russians had interfered in 2016. The last person on the planet to acknowledge that was, of course, Donald Trump, still having difficulty coming to grips with that. But what we also know from the head of the Director of National Intelligence, Coates, from the Director of the CIA, from Secretary Tillerson, is that we expect the Russians to interfere in the midterm elections. So we need to do everything we can to stop that, and that's what this legislation does. It's called the DETER Act, very simple. It says that if they get caught again, if the Director of National Intelligence finds that they've interfered in the 2018 election or any elections going forward, that you have immediate, automatic, non-waivable sanctions that really hit Russia very hard in the economic sector, the oil sector, the banking sector. So if you're Vladimir Putin and you're thinking of messing around, you're thinking of hiring another 80 people to attack U.S. democracy, you got to realize that you're going to have like a guillotine coming down in terms of the sanctions.
Susan, what do you think the impact of Friday's indictments? What do you think impact it's going to have on the Hill? We've seen Republicans tweeting enough. We've got to be aggressive. Obviously, it seems that intel chiefs and at least Republican senators are trying to get some distance between Donald Trump and themselves on this issue.
You know, I think more a holding of breath than there is of actual action. I'm not sure this is a moment. While you don't see Republicans, very many Republicans, elected Republicans, supporting the president, stepping forward to endorse his tweets over the weekend, you also don't see a wave of criticism from Republican office holders and Republican leaders. So I think there's a sense of waiting for the next shoe to drop. And one thing I wonder about, and maybe the senator would have thoughts on this, is we know this level, this phenomenal, sophisticated effort to affect our election. We know it's ongoing. The midterm election is coming up pretty quick. What is going to be the effect on Americans' trust in this election to be legitimate?
Well, that's exactly why we need to take action. That's why it's outrageous that, President Trump continues to just sit back and do absolutely nothing. He can argue about 2016. I mean, the facts are pretty clear, but nobody should be sitting back given what we're facing in 2018. And we should be hardening our systems, but we also need to be taking this deterrent measure, because the one thing we know would have an impact on Putin is if he knows for sure he's going to pay a harsh penalty, if he's going to be punished. And Rubio and I have spoken to the chairman of the banking committee. That's where this sanctions legislation is. And I believe that if we all get together, we can get a consensus to get this done.
So Michael, Max Boot wrote a column and put together some pretty interesting numbers. The Russian release of Democratic Party documents was cited 137 times by Donald Trump in the final month of the campaign.
Right.
In the final month, 137 times, he talked about what the Russians were doing. And Russian propaganda reached 126 million Americans over the course of the campaign. And we had a campaign that was decided by fewer than 80,000 votes over states. How likely is it that historians are going to look back on this election and wonder whether, in fact, the Russians swayed the outcome?
It was so close, almost anything could have tipped it, and you've just described a big movement that obviously had influence. Donald Trump, the last 3 days, has been chilling. We have been waiting to hear, if there's hard evidence of interference by the Russians, what would he do? Any president the last 70 years would have given a speech, maybe from the Oval Office, saying, this is my response, this is the American response to the Russians for doing this, this is the way I will protect you in the future. Donald Trump isn't doing that, and you combine that with his attacks on the intelligence agencies, FBI, Justice Department, hollowing out of the State Department, we're going to have to start asking some pretty haunting questions. Is this someone who wants to weaken our democracy, and is he doing this because he's frightened in some way of compromise by the Russians?
End of the midterms coming up. Michael Beschloss, thank you very much. Senator Chris Van Hollen, thank you as well. Thanks for what you're doing. Still ahead.